Do you like books? I mean, really, really like books? Then you're in the right place. Each week, your host, Sam Hankin, interviews the best of today's top-selling authors and the up-and-coming superstars of modern literature. This is The Avid Reader. Here is your host, Sam Hankin.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of The Avid Reader, brought to you by Wellington Square Bookshop. Our guest today is Ken McNab, author of Shake It Up, Baby, The Rise of Beatlemania and the Mayhem of 1963. The hardcover was published by Pegasus and released earlier this month, I think May 7th. Ken's also written, and in the end, kind of like bookending the book at the last days of the Beatles, and also more esoterically, I guess, the Beatles in Scotland. So 1963, 61 years ago, I was 11. And back then there was this exchange program in which you could employ a governess from England. And my brother Richard was 2 years old, and we hired Eileen from Liverpool. And she already knew the Beatles from the Cavern. And for Christmas that year, she gave us an album introducing the Beatles on VJ Records. And Ken talks about VJ. And, you know, like the Beatles recorded 14 songs on Please Please Me, but in the United States, we do 12. So they eliminated Please Please Me and Ask Me Why, which I guess was the first single release. And then, so they also thought that Paul didn't really mean to put in 1, 2, 3, 4 at the start of I Saw Her Standing There, but for some reason they left 4 in. And it drove my brother and I crazy. And I took up the guitar lessons, but that only lasted for a month because my teacher fired me because of my lack of practice. Then later, then we were obsessed. Then on the first day it was released, excuse me, we went up the block to Jenkintown and we brought I Feel Fine, which when we heard the feedback, and Ken can correct me, but the idea that feedback being used as a musical instrument, and then the B-side was She's a Woman. And if you eliminate the introduction, She's a Woman, the beginning of it sounds almost like it is I Feel Fine. Anyway, that's just my thought. And then, so we bought it, that was on Capitol Records, and I still have all of them. And it had that classic orange and yellow yin yang label, and we used to like watch it spin and kind of morph. And then this is very juvenile, but when we played Do You Want to Know a Secret by George Harrison, you could slow the album down with your finger. And instead of him saying, let me whisper in your ear, he would say, let me whisper in your rear. We thought that was very funny.
Lost in translation, Stan.
That's true. And also, you know, I never knew who was singing back then. I just always pretended it was John because he was my hero. Anyway, as Ken talks about in the book, and when he talks about how the show must go on and Mr. Epstein's credo, you know, there was the Beatles assassination. Sorry, John F. Kennedy's assassination. And Mr. Long, our music teacher, sent us home early that day. And I walked home just like Paul might have thought, thinking this didn't happen. This is just a joke. And then, of course, it wasn't. And then when I was really excited about the Beatles, I excitedly told Mr. Long, the music teacher, about them. And he laughed and snidely said, they'll be gone in 6 weeks. And here we are, 61 years later, and someone else will be interviewing another author about the Beatles 61 years from now. But let's talk today in this interview. So welcome, Ken. Thanks for coming on the show.
No, Sam, thank you very much for having me.
So being a bookseller, as I am, I'm always interested in the covers. And I say this to every author, even though people say you can't judge a book by its cover, everyone who comes from the bookstore does exactly that. So I always ask, you know, about the title, because Twist and Shout figures prominently in the book, and the cover photos. So tell us a little bit about that to get us started.
Well, the cover photograph for the book in the US is markedly different than the one in the UK and Europe, and is actually quite a happy accident in the sense that I like the one for America, and I did try to get something similar for the UK version, which had all that kinetic movement if you're going to have a title which is "Shake It Up, Baby," which is also, everybody will know, is a key lyric from Twist and Shout, and I thought it had a bit of momentum about it. It was a sort of affirmative statement, and I really did want to get I'm sure some of your viewers will know about the Twist and Shout EP, which has got them all jumping up and down at what was really a World War II crater in London. And it's a great iconic picture because it just captures all that, youthful exuberance of them at that time. And the cover for this book in America tries to match that kind of joyful, youthful effervescence that was so pivotal to them at the time, because they really did come out of left field and really, took the world of culture by the horns, really. But 1963, really, they're just young boys in a sense, out there to have fun like any other band and not knowing where it could possibly go.
It's funny. Also, the other thing was, I love the Foo Fighters, and you could have lots of people blurb this book, and you talk about a lot of them in the book, and they give their own perspective on how, whether it's Elvis Costello or whether it's Phil Collins or whether it's Tom Petty. But you chose Dave Grohl to give the blurb, and I wonder if that was the publisher or whether you decided how that came about.
No, I did decide, but I did decide to have Dave Grohl. He's obviously very tight with McCartney, but I mean, I think he's his understanding of the place that the Beatles have in the pantheon of rock and roll is very sincere. I mean, it's no secret that Kurt Cobain was a massive John Lennon fan, and people might not always automatically associate Seattle's grunge with the Beatles because there's a markedly different musical tone. But I always say, Sam, that the Beatles have become history's greatest legacy band. They act as this kind of fountainhead, and everything really pours from them down through the decades. And I think you're absolutely right. I think that in another 60 years' time, 70 years' time, we will still, somebody, I'll be pushing up daisies by then, but somebody will still be talking about the impact that this band had on culture, fashion, music, the entire world, really. And it just so happened that I mean, I could have had my pick of, Tom Petty, Bruce Springsteen. Springsteen and McCartney were together last night in London. Springsteen was presented with an Ivor Novello Award. So I think Paul has become the godfather of rock and roll in a sense, and they all congregate round him. And it was nice to see. I mean, they're clearly very friendly. But I thought Dave Grohl really brought a sense of topicality to it. And let's face it, Sam, everybody loves Dave Grohl.
Yeah, I do
He's,
too.
he's clearly the nicest man in rock.
Yep, I agree 100%. It's funny though, the other thing he's done is, sometimes Ringo never got the credit he deserved, and Dave Grohl and poor Taylor Hawkins, another one of my heroes, they both, were ecstatically enthusiastic about Ringo and the Ringo technique that people don't realize actually exists. They just, because he only had one solo, in an entire career. And so that was another reason I thought, because they give him a lot of credit.
Yeah, I'm a huge Ringo fan. I mean, I know people will say, well, he would say that, wouldn't he? But I am a huge Ringo fan for the reasons that you just mentioned, and I think he's an incredible drummer. In fact, if anything, I think that his reputation is burgeoning more and more these days, because I think people, especially with remixes, Sam, where you can hear the drums are louder in the mix and you can actually hear what he brings to the song. And I've been listening to a lot of songs, and with the beauty of YouTube these days, you can isolate the drum tracks, and frankly, this guy's drumming is off the charts. He's not showy in a John Bonham way or a Keith Moon way, but what he brings to the song, and certainly what he brought to the material of John Lennon, Paul McCartney, and George Harrison is absolutely outstanding. And even if you listen to a song like, for example, "Here Comes the Sun," it's got incredible percussive movements in it. And I'm not a drummer, but I can appreciate what he brings to the song. And in fact, more and more, I believe, rightly or wrongly, and people are quite entitled to their opinions. That's the beauty of music. But I think that Abbey Road especially has the best and the most consistently brilliant drumming of any album I have ever heard, with the exception perhaps of Who's Next, which is also good. But I do think, and also it looks to me, Sam, as if Ringo keeps a portrait in the attic, because quite clearly he's getting younger by the years, and rather than like the rest of us limping into the autumn of our years.
Yeah, it's funny that when you talk about that, there's a couple of things. I'm writing down notes because I'll forget them because I'm old. But you're talking about Paul being the elder statesman. I know why doesn't anyone die anymore? Like Keith Richard, Mick Jagger, Trump, Biden, Paul. Everyone's
Well,
81.
it's absolutely interesting. I mean, it's the old joke, Sam. What the younger people who are the next generation to us and beyond them are going to have to decide what kind of world they leave for Keith Richards and cockroaches. Because Keith looks as if he would, even in the aftermath of a nuclear Armageddon, Keith would still somewhere be sitting with his Gibson guitar, and a bottle of Jack Daniels at his side, and be impervious to the fallout. But yeah, you're right, but these guys won't last forever.
No. Well, you know what? In 2 weeks, I'm seeing the Rolling Stones in Philadelphia. And it's not that I really want to see them, but you know how they come out on that walkway and do their acoustic set, sit down and all that? So I had tickets on the first row of the acoustic set stage because I really just anthropologically want to look at them and see if Keith with his arthritis is still actually, I just want to go to see what this looks like at 80 years old.
I mean, there are counter arguments about whether they should do it. And who am I to say they shouldn't do it? If they want to do it and they feel they can do it and they sound fine and they look fine, then, what right have I to have an opinion on whether they're too old? If they want to do it, then feel free. I mean, I don't think it would be a stretch to say that Paul McCartney's singing voice is not what it was. How could it be? And I mean, the Stones don't do it that often. McCartney does it all the time. If it's not in the studio, it's out touring. So there's bound to be some inevitable wear and tear. But like I say, who am I? If he wants to do it. I mean, the one that always surprises me is in fact Ringo Starr, who I know isn't a bona fide singer, but he sounds fantastic. I mean, if you like and also the fact that he gives it members of the All-Star band their moment in the spotlight, So I've seen Ringo. I saw Ringo in Scotland a few years ago, and he was. I mean, I have to say that could be easily 15 years ago, and he's still treading the boards. What a trooper!
Yeah, that reminds me, since you're talking about whether they can still do it or not, what did you think of Now and Then? Like the first time you heard it and the 20th time you heard it?
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, most people knew about the song's existence and have done for a long time. John's demo is slightly rough. The original demo from 78, 79-ish, very rough, unfinished lyrically. But I always felt that there was a germ of a really good song there. And if you've heard some of the online versions where other musicians have taken the song and used some of it and completed it, and it sounded really strong. But when I heard what Peter Jackson had done by, extricating John's voice, isolating it through the new use of, audio technology, and what the rest of them had done, frankly, I think it's absolutely fantastic. I really do. I listened to it last night, and I keep waiting, Sam, for that moment when I don't like it. And that hasn't kicked in yet. I heard it last night. I was actually listening to. I had some time on my own. My wife was out doing a line dancing last night, and so I had some time on my own. So I was listening to some old Genesis and things like that. And you know what it's like in YouTube? It just comes on to the next track, and up comes Now and Then, and I think it's extremely powerful. Leaves you quite nostalgic actually, and very sentimental for obvious reasons. And so I don't hate it yet. And if it's a toss up between Now and Then and Maxwell Silver Hammer, well, I'm sorry. Now and Then,
Yeah,
comes straight out the traps.
Mal Evans on the anvil.
And then,
It's funny. I'm getting off track and we're trying to sell the book, but when you said Genesis, I was thinking, because I was just listening to Carpet Crawlers, and I was really, I don't know if you agree with me, I like Genesis so much better with Peter Gabriel. I can't help it. It just, the song.
So did I. I wouldn't say I liked it better. I think I liked them, the both eras of the band, for different reasons. Phil Collins brought us a very blokish kind of approach to the songs, and he became a huge star in his own right. It's very sad to see him in such ill health these days. But yeah, I'm a great fan. I would say after the Beatles, Genesis are probably my go-to band. They're the only band, and I have to say I love music. Absolutely. I mean, any kind of music. I think we're so lucky to have music in our lives if you're a great fan. I can listen to anything from Rush to Rachmaninoff, from the Beatles to Beethoven, and from Stravinsky to Sinatra. I'm very comfortable listening to, but Genesis are the only band next to the Beatles that have probably got everything that I could possibly hear. And as for Carpet Crawlers, one of my favorites, absolutely one of my favorites.
So spooky and so intellectual, and so it's just, it's like back when I was in altered states of consciousness, it was a really scary. Well, you're tripping. Anyway, now I'm really getting in trouble. But one of the things I was going to ask you is, especially since we're talking like this, is why do you think after, like we said, all these decades, why do you think you still have this incredible, which comes through in all of your books, enthusiasm? How has it carried over for well over 2/3 of your life?
It's almost a very difficult question to answer. As I say, I like a lot of other bands, but nothing has quite resonated with me as much as the Beatles. And I think the reason for that is that, it took me quite a while to appreciate exactly what they bring to the table. And in the end, it's a very simple answer. The answer is that the songs make me happy. I can put the songs on any album and hear something I hadn't heard before. But at the end of the day, encapsulated in 2.5, 3 minutes of music, that it puts me in a much better place. But in tandem with that, I should say that everybody's aware of the music and the impact. But I've always been fascinated as a journalist, Sam, even from a young age, about the story of the Beatles. It's not just about the music. It's about the story. It's about how fate's stars aligned perfectly when these four guys got together. And I do love the story of how they met and how they gelled, and the journey that they went on as young men. And people should remember that when the Beatles split up, John Lennon wasn't even 30. He was 29 years of age. I mean, 29, you're still learning about life, but these guys, it seemed to me, within that very short time frame, lived a million lives, and gained such a sense of universal wisdom, in a sense. I mean, Ringo Starr, had a very, very ill childhood and a very poor education. But a lot of these guys, Sam, they seem to graduate from the University of Life, in a sense. And I always say that to young people, that once you leave school, it's important to have an education, but once you leave school, you kind of make your own luck if you're prepared to work hard at it. And that's one of the things about the Beatles, is that these four guys worked incredibly hard in the studio. I mean, you just have to look at the amount of albums that they made during what is essentially quite a short time scale. I mean,
Easy.
nowadays bands take 5 years to make an album. Well, these guys were churning out two a year, and each one was measurably progressing more than the last one.
Yeah, it's funny because you talking about this and you say it was a relatively short period of time. At the time, since I was, I was young. When you're young, time goes on forever. I thought, oh wow, this is amazing how they've changed over all these years, but it's been so long. And now I think if you go back to the year COVID started in 2020, that's basically the entire career of the Beatles.
I know.
It's
I
four
mean,
and a
it
half,
is, you know.
and it's like hard to imagine that from the songs you talk about in 63 that you end up with Ringo playing the second half of Abbey Road. It's just like, if you think about it now, from looking backwards and having the perspective I do, for good or for bad, it's amazing to think that not only was it only 5 years, 6 years, 5.5 years, well, obviously from 1957, but
Yeah.
as far as your book is concerned, but it was just the evolution. How does something evolve so quickly? That was what was most amazing to me. And of course, it really happened with Rubber Soul.
Yeah, I mean, I think they were incredibly tight as a group of friends. I think the term, the term band of brothers is perhaps overworked, but not with these guys. I think they were incredibly tight, and just it just seems to be that they had some kind of chemistry together that allowed them to, finesse and work at such a pace, at real speed. And there was constant demands on them. George Martin is in the studio and he's tapping away. Now, come on, boys. I need an album by next Tuesday. And of course, they would hunker down in the studio and they would come up with 12, 13 songs, but they thought this was very natural. They thought every band did this, and of course that's not the case. But they were extremely prolific. It's almost uncanny how they were able to produce such a body of work, such a body of quality work. I mean, if you look at other contemporary bands from that era, for example, the Hollies or the Animals, they had by and large run out of steam by within 3 years or so. There aren't that many, although they left a great legacy and a great body of work. They didn't really have the staying power that the Beatles had to keep on producing high quality product year in, year out.
It's interesting you say how the songs make you happy. There's many great things about the book, but the book made me happy too. And I think even for people who are neophytes, the new generations and Gen Z, whatever the gen is now, just reading this. And then what happens is, like every good book, you go outside the book. And of course, I hate the term, but you go down the rabbit hole. And I ended up moving on to Booker T and the MGs and Green Onions and Buddy Holly, obviously. But even for some reason, like Del Shannon, Runaway, I'm thinking. And then I remembered how in the gymnasium in 1963, during lunchtime, they would actually play music.
Yeah.
Just like the employees who almost walked out. They would play music and would be sitting there listening to all this music, Buddy Holly and the Beatles. And it was incredibly nice of the administration to allow us to do that.
Did you say you were 11 in 63?
Yeah.
Well, you see, you're an incredible. I'm at incredible disadvantage because I was, but let me think, 1 year old at that point. So you were in an incredible position of actually being in the fortunate position of living it as it happened.
Yeah.
And sometimes I think it's very difficult for people who weren't at that juncture to put themselves into that world. You're having to rely on eyewitness accounts. And that's what I did. I tried very hard to speak to people who were, if you want to, for want of a better phrase, who were eyewitnesses to history. People like yourself, because you lived it. I didn't live it. you lived it, and what an incredible time it must have been to have been a teenager at that point.
Yeah, I went to Woodstock. But the thing about it is that you're right. And living through it, I immediately gravitated to John Lennon because his sense of humor, maybe you can even already tell, is very similar to mine and very cynical, very biting, sometimes exceed boundaries. But that reminds me then, because I was reading the book, because he was like a god to me. And I kind of feel like I wish, horrible to say, I wish two other people had died instead of John Lennon and George Harrison. It's a horrible thing to say, but I think that was the heart and soul. Even though the more I know about Paul, the more I realize that Paul essentially became the heart and soul of the Beatles. But that being said, yeah, when I read the book, because of my feelings about John, I felt like, why is he giving such short shrift to John? Because so much of it is about John getting into two different fistfights, saying horrible things to like Paul's girlfriends, to just people in general. And I thought, is this really the man? Or is just I don't know, a part of his personality because of his insecurities and his grief and his losses?
Yeah, I mean, I like yourself, I'm a massive John fan. To me, he was the beating heart of the Beatles. The creative driver, certainly in the early years, before um, before substances maybe took some of that creativity, took some of that impetus away. But in the early years, I mean, he was the absolute, and throughout. I mean, nowadays, I mean, if you ask Paul or Ringo, then they would all be deferential towards John and say he was unquestionably the leader of the band, even though had it not been for Paul's work ethic, then it wouldn't have happened the way it did. But for all that, I'm a massive John acolyte. I don't think you can sugarcoat some of the flaws in his makeup and his personality. You're absolutely right. He was carrying a lot of emotional baggage, certainly in his early years, having lost his mum at a terrible point in his life, and his upbringing, and I think he did tend to that anger came out in his personality, and he did tend to rail against, well, whoever happened to be in front of him, and that would at times include Paul, at times it would include George, and at times it would include Ringo. But as Paul McCartney used to say, sometimes if he was being a bit aggressive, he would just lower his glasses and say, "It's only me. It's only me." But again, I think John Lennon was a terrible loss to music. Whether he would have carried on making music is a moot point. But you know, without John, then you don't have the Beatles at any point really. Um, but I don't think you can, as I say, I don't think you can sugarcoat the flaws in his makeup. He could become difficult with alcohol when he was young. I think it's an interesting point because sometimes you don't realize that the Beatles had. I mean, you think of all this time and you think, I always think, Sam, that in the 60s you'll be better placed than me to say but it seems to have a sort of elasticity to it. You know that I look at accounts of their lives and I think, did you ever sleep? Did you ever go to bed? I mean, they just seem to have this 24/7 lifestyle. And because they were young, and maybe because it was a new generational transitional thing, that they just seem to be able to run on batteries that never went out.
Do you remember, because you mentioned her in the book, which I was so happy you did you ever see that documentary about Frida, good old Frida?
Yes, I did.
Um, because two things. One, John fired her because he was some son of a bitch. And then George in the Christmas album, when he said he said hi to good old Frida.
Frida, yeah.
And that reminded me of, well, first of all, everyone said what a wonderful person George was. And the second thing, I had no idea. There's so many things in the book, but I had no idea that he went to America and that his sister lived there. that was such a cool story.
Well, I thought it was a good story. I really did. And that's why, again, to speak to people who had first-hand knowledge of it. Because you know what happens, Sam, and as somebody who has a very keen interest in books, you'll appreciate that, stories become legends and legends become myths. And so it's very important to try and dial down into the truth of events. But 70 years down the line, it gets harder and harder to establish some kind of veracity, rather than just rely on second, third, even fourth hand quotes. And by that time, the stories have been twisted and embellished out of all proportion. So I tried very hard, and I know other authors in the same position. We do try hard not to try and reheat a souffle. We try really hard to establish the truth. And if there's any doubt about whether something's correct or not, then you would leave it out.
Yeah, it's funny because maybe you should tell a couple of stories about myths or basically prevarication. You can tell the Capitol story, which is fascinating because I kept thinking how stupid they were. And then just a little one. Tell the first one. Tell the Ed Sullivan story, how he said he was over there. He wasn't over there.
I mean, with regard to George?
No, with regard to Ed Sullivan pretending like he had been over there and it actually.
Oh, yes. Sorry. Yes. Yeah. Well, again, anybody who, I mean, you have to tie, when you're trying to construct a narrative, you're trying to pull all these threads together. It's a bit like a mystery. It's a bit like an investigation. And then it's only when you look at it and you think, hang on a second, if that happened there and that happened here, then that can't possibly be right. I mean, Ed Sullivan dined out for decades on the story that he saw the Beatles at an airport in London when they were arriving back from, I think it may have been Sweden, and he saw this mayhem unfolding before his eyes, and a light bulb popped, and Ed thought, oh, I must get these guys on the show. They'll go down a storm. And of course, when eventually, the arrangements were put in place for them to appear in the show in early '64, Ed was quite happy to spin the story that, he'd seen them firsthand and he'd witnessed Beatlemania in its embryonic state. And of course it was rubbish because he hadn't been to England at that time. His own diaries actually point to the fact he was in America. But he did have talent spotters in England at the time, and they were relaying reports to him about this young band who were tearing up trees and creating such a frenzy. So, it's not as if he wasn't aware of them. He was aware of them, but he just chose blindly to ignore them. He wasn't the only one, I have to say. You mentioned Capitol Records, for months never touched them. And I think the famous phrase was that we don't see the Beatles doing anything in this market. Thank you very much and good night. But Ed was quite happy to dine out in the story. And of course, all those people who are loyal to him were very reluctant to pierce that bubble, and pierce that balloon and speak the truth. But one or two of them, if you read between the lines, they're all saying, well, if that's what Mr. Sullivan said, then that's what Mr. Sullivan said. But in brackets, but we know he's talking absolute rubbish. So close brackets,
A technical question, I guess you might call it technical, is I didn't quite understand because of the relationship business-wise between EMI and Capitol. And towards the end, it did happen. When EMI realized, but a lot of people never kind of realized, but when EMI realized what they had, why didn't they push harder? And why didn't Capitol succumb to their pressure?
Well, it's an interesting because Capitol were actually a subsidiary of EMI. EMI were in fact the parent company, and they should have been arguably they should have been more forceful. But EMI's boss at the time, I think it was Alan Livingston, and the A&R guy Dexter. Dexter really called the tune in a sense, and he wasn't a fan. He couldn't hear anything in the music, and and that was the be all and end all. And that's why they ended up in minor labels such as you mentioned at the top of the show, VJ, and of course later Swan. These very minor labels, and they didn't shift very many copies because how could they? There's no marketing impetus. You certainly couldn't compare any of these labels to Capitol Records. But it's amazing how, again, I did the book on a month by month basis, the same as In the End, to try and capture that movement on and how it became that typhoon, if you like, begins to pick up speed month by month by month. And by the time you get to December, through a combination of incredible circumstances, really, that all of a sudden Capitol capitulated and, suddenly realized, oh my God, what have we done?
It's funny. You talk about, well, first of all, one thing, and I got to write this down because I will forget it. The idea of going chapter by chapter was a genius, because it really, especially for people who are neophytes, it really laid out the fact that in your town or in your country, maybe 19 people might have seen him in January. And then they're at the Palladium, booked for Ed Sullivan, and John sang Rattle Your Jewelry before Princess Margaret. It's impossible. It's all impossible to have happened in 1 year. And like you said, did they ever sleep? 249 gigs. But what I was thinking of when you talk about me is, and this was so stupid, Bob and I were so excited when that Tony Sheridan album came out, because we thought, this is amazing. And, it's going to be My Bonnie. But then we listened to it, and it was like you said, it was such a scam. And we were so pissed off.
Yeah, that was the savage young Beatles. They look like punk rockers before the punk rockers. Amazing, really, But the other thing I tried to do, Sam, with the book was to set it against the backdrop of, in this country, at least in 1963, a backdrop of social and political upheaval, and to place it front and center of all the things that were happening outside the Beatle bubble. In a sense, we've got a change of, the government of the day, the Conservative government of the day was under severe pressure. Young people for the first time had more money, more disposable income in their pockets. People were actually, looking at what you might call foreign holidays. I mean, very few people in Britain in that country, because you must remember that the end of the Second World War is not even a generation away. It's 18 odd years or so from the end of World War II. So it wasn't that long that the draft, as you would call it in the States, had been abolished. I mean, if it had been another year, then it's not inconceivable that John and Ringo especially could have been called up as army reservists. So there was an awful lot of social upheaval.
He was born 1940.
Yeah.
The height of the war, as far as Britain was concerned, in keeping itself alive. But yeah, it's and then you do talk about, when you talk about all these things, the stars aligning, the idea that, okay, it's Boxing Day, transistor radios, all those. Talk briefly. I talk too much. Talk briefly about that one moment there where it was the perfect time for the album to be released, and then there's a whole bunch of reasons why it was released at that time early.
Well, the charts were very very asinine. You've got likes of Frankie Valli or Cliff Richards. Elvis has shot his bolt. He's in the army. The green shoots of rock and roll have withered on the vine, and there's nothing really to, young people thrive in music. They thrive in rock and roll. I mean, nowadays, look at the effect that Taylor Swift's having on her generation, which is great. I don't hear it myself, but that doesn't matter. I've got a daughter who's going to see her in 2 weeks' time, and she can't wait. So, good, fine. Every generation should have a hero or a heroine. But that first album, I mean, you talked about, the very first album in the UK, essentially, that first album and the very first track, Sam, and it's a pity that you only hear 4, because I hear 1, 2, 3, 4, bang. And to me, that very first track, on the very first album, I saw her standing there, is like the sound of a jet on the runway. And that's when the 60s start, when that jet rushes down the runway, and that intro with all that pent up enthusiasm suddenly unleashed is the sound of the 60s starting for me anyway, musically speaking. It's just an incredible track, and I still think that I still think as a debut album, it's a very good record. They sound great. I mean, when you consider the facts and circumstances of how it was done in one day, not all the tracks were done in one day, because you know they had four of them were already singles with a B-side, but nevertheless they still had to do the rest. And of course you've got that tour de force at the end with Twist and Shout. But it's just a sound of as I say, this epoch shaking moment that, and all of a sudden young people across the country were electrified by the sound of this new band. But you know, they could have lasted, they could have done one more album and disappeared forever. And the reason it didn't is just through their sheer innate talent combined with the mood of the times.
And the other part of the story that you tell is how important, even to a lesser extent, Mal Evans, who is another one of my heroes, just watching Peter Jackson's Get Back. But the honor system that both George Martin and Mr. Epstein had, like the idea that, I don't know particularly why, but that he felt a single couldn't be on an album because it would be giving the public, it would be unfair to the public.
Yeah, he thought that by putting singles on the album that you were somehow or other scamming the public. You know, you were asking them to pay something twice. So likes of From Me to You and She Loves You, obviously, I Want to Hold Your Hand, are not on conventional albums at that time. They're not on Please Please Me, and they're not on With the Beatles. Which in some sense maybe made them more seen as sort of an everyman band, you know, that men of the people, and you know, but that was obviously a record company decision. But again, it just increased it, ramped up the pressure on them to produce enough product to satisfy public demand.
Yeah, it's funny because the other side of the coin, literally, is that when George is writing to Astrid and saying he didn't have any money, which was kind of an exaggeration, it reminded me of, again, a lot of the things I didn't know, like the merchandising, and Brian Epstein just, no, this is too much. I just can't handle this. And how much the Beatles lost because of that. That just one thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's a familiar tale in rock and roll. I mean, John Lennon once advised a young band, whatever you do, make sure your brother, the lawyer's your brother, um, if you want to, you know, avoid any potholes. Um, but yeah, but I mean, Epstein's become an easy target over the years for the amount of money that they lost through very poor merchandising deals. But to be fair to Brian Epstein, you know, he was in the eye of the hurricane. Nobody, nobody had been placed in that position before, where so much money, so many dollars were at stake. Now, you could argue that, well, hang on a minute, what about Tom Parker? Well, yeah, but, you know, the Beatles were a new phenomenon, and with every new phenomenon, the stakes are increased. There's more money. There's four guys here. I mean, we're not, you know, can you imagine if it was four Elvises, you know, and you multiply the earning potential by four? So, you know, you've got your George dolls, you've got your Paul dolls. I mean, all of a sudden, all these, you know, all these entrepreneurs suddenly realized what an opportunity they had. So I'm not one to blame Brian for his naivety, and he was naive. I think the whole thing just overwhelmed him. I mean, you know, he's one guy, Sam, and he's looking after everything. The words control freak may well have been invented for Brian Epstein, because he couldn't delegate, and if he tried to delegate, he wasn't happy with the outcomes. So he thinks, I'll do it all myself. And it's impossible to do it all yourself when you're managing the biggest band in the world and everybody wants a slice of it.
And the other thing is that, and most people, and I knew about it a little bit, don't know about the relationship that Brian Epstein had and wanted to have with John and the way John treated him. And he had all this on his plate at the same time. Plus, you imply and are right about the fact that even with this, he could not be a happy person, was not happy.
No, it's a very, Brian's story is a very sad story. You know, he was such a pioneer. You know, he's a pop pioneer, if you like. But he never really seemed to be. I mean, his whole life, his entire life revolved around those four guys. And it's no secret that he had, you know, he had an affection towards John Lennon, and John knew this and was quite happy to play up to it, and to cement his position in the band. You know, but as I say, Brian was placed in an invidious position when it came to merchandising, and it's an easy stick to beat him with about how much money they lost. But you know, over the years, you know, I think we should be thanking Brian for the impact that they had, for the music that they produced, and for the staying power that they endured.
Yeah, and that's what you talk about. You talk about he always wanted what was best for the boys and the lads. And the idea that, as I said, George Martin and he had, unlike today, this absolute sense of honor. And my dad was the same way, you know, all of his deals that he made in real estate were just on a handshake. It was 15 or 20 years before he agreed to have an attorney write a contract. And he said, it can't be more than one page long.
Yeah, well, I was very fortunate, Sam, to speak to a number of people who were aware or had some first-hand knowledge of the deals that Brian made, and they said exactly as you said, which was the minute Brian shook your hand, then that was, you know, that was his bond, that was his word of honor, and you know, famously, in the middle of 1963, Brian. I mean, it's interesting to know that the first world tour, the first foreign tour outside the UK, apart from a very short jaunt to Sweden, was actually in Australia, and the arrangements for that were made in the summer of '63, and I managed to track down the father of one of the guys who was involved in the negotiations, and he was able to confirm exactly how his father felt about, you know, shaking hands with Epstein, doing the deal, making the arrangements, sealing the negotiations, and pivotal to all that, Sam, was the fact that Brian Epstein was considered a very honourable man, naive perhaps. You know, there was an opportunity to make a bountiful sum of money, but when Brian said, "No, this is what we agree," then they stuck by that, and they could have earned. There's no question they could have earned a lot more. You know, I mean, it was a never-ending supply of money, and lots of people got rich in the back of the Beatles. But you know, the Beatles themselves earned quite a lot of money, but you know, there was a crippling tax situation in this country at the time. You know, so you know, I mean, I read the other day that McCartney's become Britain's first music billionaire.
Yep.
But people forget that Paul McCartney's been a millionaire since 1966. So even allowing for bad merchandising deals, even allowing for crippling tax penalties, you know, these guys still earned a colossal amount of money.
You know, it's funny you talk about, and it's totally true, the stars aligning. And it hadn't happened yet. And I think it's good that you stopped with 63, not before actually your epilogue does talk about a little bit what happened afterwards, but that that Hard Day's Night was in the works, and that Dick Lester, talk about honor, he goes, I'll do it for nothing.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. I mean, you know, again, it's interesting because people are maybe unaware of the intricacies involved in arranging something like Hard Day's Night and trying to get these guys on board, trying to get George Martin on board, trying to get Brian Epstein on board, and the demands in their time are absolutely incredible. So you have to really dig down into the sediment of history and try and pull out these nuggets and read a lot and try and correlate all the information you can, and try and establish, as I said earlier, the truth of things. So, you know, the likes of the Hard Day's Night negotiations, who was going to write it? They had a Liverpool guy, Alan Owen, and I managed to, I think, establish how it came to be that he was on board. And you know, sometimes, as I said, there's an accepted version of events, and it's easy to make mistakes. And you know, guilty is charged, Your Honour. I'm quite sure. It's very difficult to be 100% precise, but all you can do is try your best.
Yeah.
I mean, I did find, in fact, I've got it here. I did manage to find a copy of. Oh, I've got books. It's interesting to see your backdrop of books there. They look absolutely fantastic. But I managed to find a copy of David Picker's biography, and he was the head of United International, United Artists, I think, the film company at the time. And it's buried away in the book how he talks about how they came to get the Beatles to do A Hard Day's Night. And it's a fascinating story, but that story may well have been buried had you not been able to, and then I had to phone somebody else to try and establish whether in fact it was correct or not. But it's good fun. Listen, I tell you, it's great fun doing these things. It can be a bit, you know, it can be a bit draining, and you need a lot of energy. But as I said earlier, they're a fascinating story. I did in the end, because I thought the end of the band that year was you know, such an interesting year, and I had no great plans to do, for want of a better phrase, a prequel. But when I looked at 63 and all the things, and such a transformative year, and not, as I said, not just with the Beatles, but with the country and the world. And as you mentioned earlier, how you go from playing to 19 odd people in a very remote Scottish location in January to, at the end of the year, playing at the London Palladium, playing at the Royal Variety Performance, and the streets outside are under siege from kids. And it's not a bad thing, you know, as I said, holding out for a hero. We all love our heroes and we all love our musical heroes. So I don't think it's a bad thing. I think it was a very good thing.
Yeah. And the other thing, again, about the Stars is that they were lucky they weren't killed. I mean, they were lucky they escaped with their lives. It was almost war. They could have been pulled apart because of the girls who were after them.
They absolutely could have, you know, and they used to devise all sorts of methods to try and get them out of theatres and cinemas and venues. I mean, there are stories of them clambering over rooftops to try and get to reach. And the other thing to remember, Sam, is that you're talking about a very small group of people involved with the Beatles. You know, I've just finished Ken Womack's excellent book on Mal Evans, which was very interesting. And so, you know, you've got the four guys in the band, you've got two roadies, you've got Neil Aspinall and Mal Evans, two roadies, and it's their job to get them in, and it's their job to get them out with all their limbs intact. And then you've got Brian Epstein as the manager, then you've got George Martin in the studio, and that's it. That is it. I mean, these guys changed the world, and there's only, how did I mention there, 4, 6, 8 of them. That's a slight exaggeration. There are obviously other members of the team, like good old Frida for a start, but essentially that core. I suppose I could maybe add Dick James as the publisher of Northern Songs, but it's a very small core of individuals who are responsible for this enormous behemoth moving through the weeks and the months and the years.
You know, it's funny when you said "and in the end" just now. One of the things readers should know is you sprinkle through the books, and it's always perfectly apt, the Beatles songs in your recitation, your narrative, like when you talk about here, there, and everywhere. I can't think of all of them, but I picked up on all of them, and that was fun.
I'm guilty, as I said, guilty as charged, Your Honour. As a former tabloid journalist, I can't help puns. I love puns if they work. I don't like them if they don't work. But you know, it's as I say, it's a bit of fun. I don't like books to be taken too seriously. You know, at the end of the day, you know, as I said, I like the Beatles because they make me happy, and I hope that people who read about them, and they're an amazing band for crossing the generations. I've got a 30, well, he'll be 30 in a few weeks' time. My son Christopher, and he's not at home now, but a couple of years ago I heard him in the shower, Sam, and uh, and he was singing to his heart's content. Everybody's got something to hide except for me and my monkey. And at that point, Sam, I thought, well done, Kenny. You've done a great job.
Yep. And that's what I always say about books too. Laughter, if you have a book that makes you laugh, it's the biggest page turner there is. If you know when you turn the page there might be a laugh in it. I mean, if you're writing a very serious book, no. But in a book like this, it's teaches you a lot, but wants to entertain you as well. You turn the pages, and this one really did do that. And yeah, it's like a hard day's night. Can't you just turn on the TV or now you don't have to. Can't you just go to YouTube and watch A Hard Day's Night like over a course of a year 15 times, and it's like a each time?
Yeah. But what I tried to do with the book, and whether I succeeded is again a moot point, is to try and leave each chapter on a slight cliffhanger. Because you know, sometimes decisions that are taken in 1 month, for example, in February, you don't see the ramifications of that decision until maybe August. And so it's to try and plant the seed of, for example, and in the end, you know, when Alan Klein comes aboard and he carries out this forensic examination of their accounts, and he finds that Paul McCartney has secretly been buying up shares in Northern Songs, contrary to the agreement he has with John Lennon, and Klein stealthily says, "Oh, that's interesting," and he secrets that away. He sequesters that information, and then 3 months down the line, when there's an enormous row over Klein's appointment, then with all the Beatles, and then he suddenly decides, it's a bit like Gollum, you know, he decides that this is the moment where I shall unleash my secret knowledge, and causes mayhem when he suddenly drops into the conversation casually. "Oh, you might not know this, John, but Paul's actually been going behind your back," and that kind of you know idea that you can plant a seed in 1 month, and it's only in a few months' time that you realise, as I say, the ramifications of that. So it's trying to set the scene. It's trying to paint a picture with words.
And you're very generous in your acknowledgments, because I've forgotten the gentleman who wrote the book that you almost call it a Bible, which is the diary of pretty much every day. What's the name of that book again?
So many of them.
You know, I can't find it, but there's a book that's just like basically every day of the Beatles, and you look.
A guy called Keith Badman did a day-to-day diary, but there've been quite a few. And again, there's some contradictions in them, but I think it's impossible to get everything right. You know, history has a habit of changing shape all the time.
Yeah, and as they say, history is written by the winners as well, and those who capitalized on them are the ones who are telling the stories. Well, like, you know, look, you poor Pete Best. You know, I saw that interview with him on David Letterman where he talked about the situation and how he was unceremoniously fired, and then poor Stuart Sutcliffe. You know, we can't because we got to conclude sometime, but you know, just the story of Stu Sutcliffe. If he had lived, what would the Beatles have been? You know?
Yeah, it's all a matter of fate and ifs and buts. I mean, Stuart, I have a vested interest in Stuart Sutcliffe because he was the Scottish Beatle. You know, he came from my neck of the woods in a sense. And again, I actually did a book a long time ago. My first Beatles book was actually the Beatles in Scotland.
Right.
And that certainly wasn't, to coin a phrase, yesterday. And and it was split up into various chapters which related to their connections to Scotland. That John Lennon used to come on holiday to Scotland. McCartney had the Mull of Kintyre and Argyll, and so there's a myriad of connections. But quite chief among them was the fact that Stuart Sutcliffe was in fact born in Scotland, and his mother and father were their home in Liverpool was extremely Scottish. They had to celebrate all the usual Scottish traditions. And New Year's Eve was Hogmanay, and they had to, it was as if they lived in Edinburgh, not in Liverpool. So yeah, I was quite interested in that. And again, clearly a very talented guy, incredibly good looking, a great, potentially a great future, cut down by a tragic situation.
He was so good looking that there was jealousy, and there probably would have been more. And you talked about 8 people, but then you think about Astrid and Stuart Sutcliffe and Klaus Vormann, the cover Revolver. There were all these influences that, and Denny Lane, I
mean, this brings me back, Sam, to it's an incredible story, and I know other bands have got their own great backdraft, if you like, their own backstories. The Stones have it, the Who have it, the Foo Fighters have it. They all have great stories, great origin stories. I just don't think that any origin story competes with that of the Beatles, because there are so many tributaries, so many strands, and all merging into this great, enormous basin. And I think from a writer's point of view, nothing can compare to the origin story of the Beatles. You mentioned Astrid, you mentioned Klaus. Klaus, I think, deserves some credit as a guy who clearly has remained in incredibly good terms with them all, especially George. He's written very movingly of seeing George just not long before he died. And he's a very interesting man, and I'm sure I did speak to him at one point about Stuart. In fact, I did actually, it's that long ago, but I did speak to him about Stuart because, again, I thought it was important, even in those embryonic days, to try and establish the truth, because it's not that I don't trust journalists, Sam, it's just that I don't trust journalists.
Yeah. So, all right, this will be the last, and then we'll conclude, because I could go on for days. But so because we talked briefly about punk, talk about the cover of the second album and how you kind of say that it presaged punk, black and white, the faces, because a lot of people have no idea, because they've seen some, things that are derivative now for the younger generation seem seminal when they're derivative of that very cover. And you talk about that.
Yeah, I think the second album with the Beatles is a very stark cover, and it's become iconic because it's almost ghostly. The Mandarins and the Blazers at EMI almost had a fit when they were presented with this image of them looking very almost ethereal, very ghost-like, on this very stark black background. But the thing is that they were very happy with it. They thought, the Beatles themselves thought, that the image was very redolent, and it echoed some of Astrid Kircher's work of them in Hamburg, which captures them in that kind of almost like a twilight sort of zone, twilight background. So they loved it. They thought the picture was absolutely brilliant. And if you compare it and contrast it with the image of the cover for the first album, which is just a young, there's nothing wrong with it. Angus McBean's picture, and they're just 4 young lads having a laugh. But even this early, with the second album, this is them taking control of their own futures, of their own destiny, and they were quite prepared to put their foot down, and they did.
Talk about putting their foot down. When I was at summer camp, I had a copy of the album with them on the cover with the dead babies holding them upside down, and it was plastered over with the new cover, so I could peel it back to see the original cover. How the hell did that get past anybody?
Well, I know the censors were clearly sleeping. So well done, Sam. You must be minted beyond the dreams of avarice if you've got one of those.
I,
Beyond
yeah,
beyond
so
the
is that,
riches of Croesus.
my daughter keeps saying, clean out the garage, Dad. And I have 600 LPs out there. And, you know, from Kitaro to, I don't know, to the Hello people, to people that no one ever knew about, the Kings. Yeah, and they're worth nothing monetarily, but I can't get rid of them. Just like my books.
But if you look at that second album and then look at the rest of the covers in isolation, then there is a certain artistic element to it. It was a very brave decision by, again, Brian Epstein wasn't the laddie was not for turning, shall we say. He he was quite insistent that if the boys wanted that cover, then he was behind them. He was resolutely behind them. So it does say something for them, that, and it does say something for EMI, that eventually they recognised that it was a good cover, but more importantly, maybe, just maybe, this band had some potential. As I say, they talk about that difficult second album, Sam. Everybody talks about that difficult second album. The second album is really good. It's really strong. And but there's no indication of just how much magic was about to come round the corner.
Yeah, for those who are younger and have listened to Anthology or that Red, Yellow one, all their number ones, they think that this is an album. It's not an album, but that's what they think it is. And
well, like I say, I just think that for each album progressively they improve beyond all recognition, beyond all expectation, beyond all measure, and and people will quite often ask me whether I would have liked to have seen a Beatles reunion, and it's always an interesting question because people have different viewpoints. Personally, I'm glad they didn't actually have a bona fide proper reunion. I've got Abbey Road, the album cover here on the wall, taken by a Scottish photographer, Ian McMillan, and I look at that picture, Sam, and I see four guys walking off the page into history, and they never came back. And what you're left with is what you're left with. And I know you've got Free as a Bird, and Now and Then, and the other song from the anthology, which has just escaped me just now, which Real Love, which I quite like.
Oh yeah, and One After 909, which had a shelf life of what, 10 years, 8 years?
Yeah. And I did enjoy some of Get Back. I thought it was quite long and quite a long watch, really. There's a lot of navel gazing. And I did watch Let It Be the other night again, and I found it quite bizarre. I mean, there were some strange edits. I mean, Billy Preston, who really does lift the whole thing, suddenly appears out of nowhere. And I think in the original film, was there not some kind of introduction at the door? George says, "Oh, hello, it's Billy," and Billy Preston just appears out of nowhere. So a bit odd.
Talk about Billy Preston for hours. Jeez. But okay, last thing. I always say it's the last thing. Is even one of the lesser albums, which was Paul's Baby, Magical Mystery Tour. I can remember as if it was yesterday. And you're right, I am lucky. I can remember taking that album home, and when I first heard Roll Up, I was like, I swear, I cannot believe this.
I mean, there's some great material on there, Sam. There's some great material. I'll tell you a funny story very quickly. That I went from that. It's almost like somebody had parted a curtain, because I think I first heard them when I was about 13 on an old cassette, and it was the compilation album 62 to 66. So essentially, it's all the hit singles, right? From Me to You, etc., etc. And so that was my introduction to them, and I was unaware of, this is the point, unaware of all the great material that's on the albums. Forget the singles. The singles. Go and listen to Hard Day's Night. Go and listen to Rubber Soul. Go and listen to Revolver. Tomorrow Never Knows. My God. So, but my introduction to them was this 1962 to 66, which is very popish, for want of a better phrase. And then a friend of mine sold me the cassette for 67 to 70. So all of a sudden, I thought I was listening to a different band, and I couldn't believe how fantastic they sounded. And my favourite song has always been Strawberry Fields Forever, which I think is such a quantum leap forward. But I always loved I Am the Walrus. It's so manic, and I know it's on Mystery Tour. And it's so manic, and it's so surreal, and it's so brilliant.
It's like James Joyce, after he wrote Ulysses, said, no, it was, yeah, well, Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake, he said, all I ask of the reader is that they study my books for the remainder of their lives to figure, and that's how John was with I Am the Walrus. He goes, here, let them try and figure that one out.
Yeah, well, I would have been about the same age in when I listened to them, probably about I was about 13 or 14, and I do remember being in my mum and dad's car with an old cassette, and on the few occasions that they let me play a cassette in the car, and I would put in 67 to 70 and would come on to I Am the Walrus, and every time, Sam, it came to that line, boy, you've been a naughty girl, boy, you've been a naughty girl, you let your knickers down, and every time it came to that point, I would always cough very trying to cover it up. And now, of course, seen from the perspective of about 40 odd years down the line, 50 years down the line, in fact, I think, were your parents stupid? Of course they knew. Of course they knew. You know?
And the funny thing about it is that Please Please Me and You Bring It Out essentially had the same message. It was the same.
Well, I thought that was interesting, that nobody ever read the lyrics, Sam. They only heard the music, and quite rightly so. But when you read the lyrics of "Please Please Me," it's as near the knuckle as you can get. I mean, let's not kid ourselves. It's really it's borderline salacious, but nobody bothered. Nobody ever said a word. But I think "Please Please Me" lyrically was the most controversial song ever to have been released up to that point. I mean, it's not like Elvis, at his hip swinging best. I can't think of an Elvis track which was libidinous, but Please Please Me absolutely is libidinous in every way. And there can be no disguising Lennon's intent. And I'm just amazed he got away with it.
It's funny. And again, this will be the last thing. This may be the highest compliment I can pay you. Of course, I went and listened to the songs sometimes during the book, after the book. The other thing was, as I was reading the book, and I can sing, but not that well. But as I was reading the book, the songs were playing in my head better than they ever had. The actual song was playing in my head as I would read the book. And I thought, how is this even possible? I can't do this. I'm reading and I'm listening to the music at the same time, but there isn't any sound.
Well, that's very kind of you. If you think about a song like "She Loves You,"
yeah,
essentially, it's easy to dismiss it as it's just a pop song, but it's not just a pop song. It's got that unbelievable intro again from Ringo, that pounding drum intro, and it's an incredible piece of work. It's not just a pop song, it's a landmark moment in music history. And for you guys over there, I Want to Hold Your Hand is exactly the same. And it should be remembered that I think it was Dick Clark's Bandstand where they actually played that song, and it was laughed out of court.
Yep.
I mean, it was hugely mocked.
Yeah, they were a bunch of.
As I said, there's a whole combination of synchronicity attached to how it came about that eventually Capitol capitulated and America followed soon after.
And the other thing is about how George. Well, keep talking.
Keep talking. I'm here till Friday.
So yeah, George Martin, the way he moved what would have been the chorus, he moved. What did he move? Remember,
he said, "Why don't you begin with the chorus rather than with the verse?" So that's why you get this boom, 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 boom. She loves you, yeah. So immediately the hook is inside your head, even if you don't want it to be inside your head.
Yeah, and the pronouns are all wrong. Like you were talking about the word "you." I'm thinking, wait a minute, they're not talking about themselves.
Yeah, I mean, George Martin deserves a huge amount of credit for their success. And also they deserve a huge amount of credit for trusting him, for putting their faith in him as an older man. And, I mean, Brian Epstein was only something like 7 years older than Lennon, but he seems to be a generation away from them. And George Martin's the same with his very clipped tones, very authoritative. So it does say a lot for them that they were prepared to place in his hands their music. But I think they were quite dogmatic as well. They were open to ideas, but they were quite insistent on how they thought their music should sound.
And it's not only that, it's that George Martin would come down and he'd be playing the piano.
Absolutely,
Harpsichord that was playing a harpsichord that wasn't a harpsichord.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, absolutely amazing. Very, very talented man. And I don't think they would have achieved quite the musical heights that they did
No
without
way.
his involvement.
No way. Especially not with Phil Spector.
No. Can you imagine?
No, I don't even need to. All right. Well, like I said, we need to go to a bar and drink and do this.
Well,
Maybe.
I bet. Well, I tell you, Sam, we have an open door here. My wife's Irish, so we have an open door. You're more than welcome. In fact, we've got friends coming over from Texas in a couple of weeks' time, Fiona and David, and this house has been cleaned to within an inch of its life for these people coming over. These are people that we stayed with in Norfolk, Virginia, a long time ago in Chesapeake. So they're coming over in a couple of weeks' time. So I'm looking forward to that.
All
And
right.
and I've got a copy of the book here, so I'll make sure they can take it away with them.
All right. Well,
Person.
if you're actually inviting me, maybe I'll come.
Well, listen, as I said, you can cross the pond anytime. We have an open door. I would be absolutely delighted to see you.
That would be fun.
Any problem.
Thanks so much for doing this. It's a great book, and it'll be, well, it's only been released for a month, and yeah, it's already on the front cover of front table of our store, and there it will stay. And
Well,
music.
that's very kind of you. Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. Okay, Ken. Thanks again.
Take care. Thank you for the time. Take
Yep.
care.